The next panel is called The New Era of Working with the FBI, Best Practices and Potential Pitfalls. And we have a fantastic panel. Let me start by introducing Steve Fahey, a partner at Kirkland and Ellis in the Dallas office. Steve previously served for 18 years as an AUSA in the Northern District of Texas, where his positions included Chief of the Criminal Division, Chief of the Civil Division, and First Assistant U.S. Attorney. He's joining us today from Dallas. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks, Bruce. Glad to be here.
The star of the show here, Bryan Smith, Section Chief, Cyber Criminal Section of the FBI. We have a lot of questions for you today, Bryan. Bryan oversees the FBI's National Cyber Criminal Program, which includes the development and execution of the national strategy, the investigative oversight, budget, and funding of operations. He also developed the FBI's Consolidated Virtual Assets Unit. Bryan is joining us today from DC. Welcome, Bryan. Thank you.
Thank you. Although I'm a little nervous. Am I sitting on the defense stand now? And this is the cross-examination?
Hardly. I'm always very pleased to have Phyllis Sumner with us. She's a partner at King & Spalding and the firm's chief privacy officer. Phyllis leads the firm's data security and privacy practice. She regularly counsels corporate boards, senior executives, and other clients regarding data breach prevention and emergency incident response. She previously served as an AUSA in the Northern District of Illinois and the Northern District of Georgia. And she is joining us today from just outside West Palm Beach, Florida. Welcome, Phyllis.
Thank you, Bruce. Always a pleasure to be a part of this fantastic program.
Thank you. Finally, our moderator today is Ed McAndrew, a partner at BakerHostetler, who has been at the forefront of internet law for more than 20 years. Ed counsels clients, leads investigations, litigates matters including cybersecurity, privacy, and digital media. And he previously served as a federal cybercrime prosecutor and national security cyber specialist at the DOJ. Ed, welcome, and thank you for moderating this panel.
Thanks very much, Bruce, and hello out there to everyone, and thank you for joining us. First and foremost, I may need to take that 20 years out of my bio. I don't know how that sounds. Plus, as you're going to hear from all of us, those are cyber years, which I think are kind of like dog years. Let's kick off and talk about working with the FBI in particular, but really law enforcement more broadly when it comes to ransomware attacks. And the first thing where I want to start is ransomware is really a misnomer in terms of describing these attacks. There was once upon a time back in the good old days where ransomware really was limited to encrypting computers and holding them ransom. As you're going to hear, as you've already heard from some of the panels this morning, and you'll be hearing throughout the day, it's much more now. And the choices that you make in the response process, and quite frankly, before you encounter an incident, have consequences, have implications for how your response plays out, what liabilities you may face, what reputational harm can come from these attacks. So when we're talking about these attacks now, we're really just talking about extortion. And, extortion is age old. And one of the age old questions in extortion is, do we call the cops? Do we call the cops? Can they help us? The cops will be represented today by Section Chief Bryan Smith of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The rest of us will play both plaintiffs and defense lawyers, prosecutors, and criminal defense attorneys. I'm just joking. We're going to have a free-flowing conversation about working with law enforcement in these incidents, both the best practices for any organization and the potential pitfalls. So with that, I want everyone in the audience to keep in mind that this is your chance to ask the FBI questions and to ask former prosecutors questions that you may have never wanted to ask. Or maybe you wanted to ask them, but you chose not to. So we're going to kick off. And first, we're going to talk about the threat landscape, because I think it's important, Bryan, that we understand sort of the FBI's perspective on the landscape. And then I'll invite my panelists to join in and provide a little bit of private sector color on what we see. So Bryan, over to you.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to be with all of you today. Yeah, I just want to lay out a little bit of what we're seeing kind of in the threat landscape, and it's certainly evolved over time. I think any of us who have been in this space have seen a number of iterations, and I'm actually going to walk through quickly as some of those older ones because I think there's some learning points from those that we can then apply later on today. So when ransomware first came out, it was small dollar amounts. It was usually targeting individual CPUs and small businesses. And the advice that we gave to individuals was that, hey, if you've got good backups and you practice restoring from backups, you're probably going to be okay. And people heeded that advice and they did what we asked them to do. Then you saw a turn towards enterprise targeting by these individuals. And targeting of hospital systems and critical infrastructure and systems instead of individual CPUs. And then we saw the dollar amounts go up. That same advice as far as backups still applied. And people did that. And so you saw what I would call a nuisance problem that ransomware was there at the beginning. And I think everybody across the government, across private industry, saw it that way of, hey, we can keep this under control with maintenance. The adversary learned and adapted to what all of us did at government and then what people did in the private sector to protect themselves. And so they came up with a double extortion model where not only were they going to encrypt your data, but before they encrypted it, they were going to exfil data out of your system. And if you had backups and had practiced and could restore from those backups, you still had that problem of now your data is sitting out there for somebody else. And so now they could extort you on that. And that's where we get into this extortion model. From there, people ended up having a better job protecting. They negotiated down, but then you saw triple extortions coming in where not only they exfilled the data and then they started harassing individuals in the company. So these are employees of the company, these are executives in the company, these are family members of company members, as well as then suppliers and vendors. As companies were embarrassed by the activity that had happened, they didn't want people to know, well, now the adversary was taking advantage of that. So another example of how the adversary learns from the tactics and the techniques that we have all applied to better protect ourselves. And then now what we've seen over probably a movement over this last year and a half of straight to that extortion model, where very often and more often we are seeing it increasingly that the adversary isn't even encrypting the data. And they are just gaining access, they'll exfiltrate the data, hold it, and then extort a ransom payment for that data. So if you have backups, it does you no good because there's nothing to decrypt. If there's a decryptor available, it does you no good because there's nothing to decrypt there. So there's a really great lesson in there of the adversary is adapting to what we do. And so we have to continually adapt to what they do. And some of that comes from understanding who they are and what they do. And so the other part about the threat that I think is really important to talk about is their structure and what they've done over the last few years is that they've moved from a close-knit group that works together and has to handle everything that they do, both the delivery of the malware on the system, launching the attacks, tracking it, the communications between entities, as well as then the financial piece of it, which is the money laundering of the proceeds of the crime. That was all handled by a small group. As we move into ransomware as a service, now you have individuals who are doing portions of that for the entities. So you have access brokers who are gaining access to the system, sell that to another individual who then can launch the attacks. And so in some respects, you have some very specialized skill sets in each of those areas. But in other respects, you have very unsophisticated individuals who essentially are using a GUI interface to then launch these attacks as an affiliate. So specialization, but then less expertise in there. So that creates another difficulty for us. But it's really good for us to understand that because then it helps us to then figure out how do you apply to that? How do you address that? We also need to address it in the same way that they're doing it. So we need to understand how it is that they're doing each of those aspects of their crime and then attack and protect on each of those. You're on mute, Ed.
I'm sorry, what you're describing, Bryan, is really a conspiracy. It's not, when we talk about they and who the they is in an attack, it's not one person. It's not one actor doing one thing. It's really, at this point, a group, and it may be a very diffuse group. It may be people who certainly do not know one another personally, may not know each other's real names for certain or their locations, and they're performing different tasks toward this criminal objective of damaging systems, exploiting data, and extorting victims. So, Phyllis, I wanted to just go kick it over to you. From your perspective as somebody who's, involved in responding to incidents all the time and in seeing the long tail of investigations and litigation that follow, what's changed in the last couple of years from your perspective?
Well, I enjoyed listening to Bryan's description of the evolution of the threat actor and absolutely agree that we are seeing the same thing. I think from a private perspective, what does that mean? It means that it's difficult to predict what you will be facing with the threat actor. And even with the ransomware playbooks, they are not as applicable as they used to be based on the evolution of the activity. And it really needs to be a ransom-related playbook and take into consideration these different issues. I have seen where clients come in with a no-pay, I'll say not no-pay policy, but no-pay attitude.
Right.
We're not going to pay these criminals. And then because of the tactics that some of these threat actors now take, they know the pain points, and that'll be sometimes shocking to the company to see how they take advantage of that, like threat actor groups who do reach out directly to executives. They access their cell phone numbers. They reach out through their social media accounts. They obtain information about their family members, and it becomes very threatening and invasive. And they are reaching out to business contacts. They're sending emails that they are able to retrieve when they are in systems. So I think many organizations who are expecting to deal with a ransomware attack now feel something very different and sometimes very personal. And sometimes it's like dealing with good old-fashioned thugs, even if you determine it's appropriate to engage with them. They're not acting like business people always. They are very threatening in the way that they're coming across. So organizations need to be prepared to manage through the spectrum of activity, which also includes sometimes very unsophisticated threat actors who don't speak English very well and don't even know what they have. I mean, We had one threat actor group who was talking about all this information about board members that they were able to obtain, and it was actually public information about the Chamber of Commerce. And another group who thought they'd gotten a bunch of credit card information when they had not. So it is difficult now to prepare. And it makes you step back and think about the spectrum of possibilities and at what point you need to bring in law enforcement to help you understand and to provide some threat intelligence to give you a better sense of who you're dealing with.
I think one thing that's sort of frightening hearing, Phyllis and Bryan talk about the threat landscape and especially the triple extortion is you have to worry now about, as a company, about your cybersecurity, but also the people you work with. I think about that with the 2021 ransomware attack on Quanta, that supplier of Apple, where they had the ransom to Quanta, and there was also a ransom demand made to Apple that we're going to release your blueprints, and on our evil gang went ahead and did that when neither paid the ransom. So it's you're worried about your own network and trying to make sure everything's safe, but also are the people that you're working with, the suppliers and partners, are they protecting their systems too?
And kudos to Steve. Steve, I'm going to call you out here as the former first assistant and criminal chief and a number of other positions in the Northern District of Texas in Dallas. I know you have a sentencing coming up in your district for one of the R-Evil threat actors. So it's a great example of, instances where the government actually does get hands on someone, does put them in jail. And I think in at least one of those cases, recovered about $13 million in assets. So that's terrific stuff, Steve. And glad to have you on the private side, but we already miss you in the Justice Department. So, I think, Phyllis, going back to something you said that's important too, is these multiple layers of extortion that we're seeing. Extortion targeting executives, extortion targeting employees throughout an organization, but also extortion targeting customers, extortion targeting those outside of the organization, where the organization has data that may be at issue. And that has become particularly problematic over the last year. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about working with law enforcement and what it means to bring law enforcement is. There's so many questions. Who do you call? Ghostbusters? Like, when do you call them? What do you say? How do you get in touch? What are they going to want from you? Phyllis, Steve, what are some of the questions that you often hear from clients, without getting into confidences, of course, when you're counseling them on whether, when, and how to talk to law enforcement?
Well, I will say that it's important for clients to think about this before the incident. So just as an initial matter, it should be part of their tabletop exercises and their incident response plans to have that process for connecting with law enforcement and determine who's going to handle it. I would say that in determining the timing of reaching out to law enforcement, there still can be this circle the wagons, keep everything internal, let's wait and see what we're dealing with instead of reaching out to any third parties. I think that control is less today because of the way that the threat actors are acting, and in particular, the risk that they will go outside the organization and reach out to third parties such as customers or business partners. And we've even seen them reach out to the press, to security bloggers. So we can't sit back and wait. I think we also have to consider that it's not simply reaching out in order to provide information to the FBI, but it's also to get information back. And there is a significant benefit to reaching out and discussing the threat intelligence they may have collected. We have had sometimes threat actors that they haven't dealt with before, and we're sharing some new information. But we've also gleaned really important information. A great example was a DDoS attack by a group that purported to be associated with Lazarus, which is a nation-state actor, and they were saying that they would come back with the kind of attack that would basically bring this organization down. In reaching out to the FBI, we were quickly connected with the field agent handling the investigation and provided threat intelligence that they didn't have the firepower to do what they were saying they would do. And we were able to put a strategy together and not deal with the threat actor. And the FBI was absolutely on point. They did not come back and take any action against the organization. And in addition, sometimes if we're dealing with threat actors who are accessing account information and transferring funds, we're on a clock. We need to be able to get law enforcement involved really fast. And they've been fantastic in helping us pull money back within a short period of time. So there may be some real reasons to reach out quick, but I'll pass it to Steve and let him chime in as well.
I just want to highlight one thing that Phyllis said in particular on the pre-incident engagement. I mean, this was sort of highlighted in that 2021 incident. I think Director Ray talked about publicly, where there was an attempted cyber attack by some Iranian-backed group on the Boston Children's Hospital. And he specifically cited how the FBI and the Boston Children's Hospital had a long pre-existing relationship going back to a 2014 investigation of a cyber incident that the hospital had. So the fact that they had worked together, the IT team had been working closely over the years with the Boston field office, enabled those the field office to get to the hospital and warn them, and they were able to stop that attack before that group could, God knows what could have happened and how terrible that would have been, given the a hospital serving children, critically ill children too. So I think what Phyllis said, 100%. If you can put that in your incident response plan as a business and have your local field office contacts, develop those relationships ahead of time, when chaos breaks with one of these attacks, God forbid, you at least aren't trying to like Google where you're supposed to go. You know where you're going to go. You have pre-existing relationships, and it sort of smooths the path when everything else is going crazy.
Yeah, Steve, that's a great point. Let's stay on hospitals for a second, because it's a perfect illustration of how these threats can have physical, like real world implications for people, for public safety, for health and public safety. I was involved in one with a ransomware attack on a hospital that's resulted in litigation alleging that a death resulted from the attack. So things are changing in terms of the consequences of these attacks. Bryan, over to you to talk a little bit about, we've heard about the intelligence function and how the Bureau is really sort of playing a role of helping victims from an intelligence perspective in their response. Can you talk a little bit about how things have changed in the Bureau with regard to the structure for how you're attacking or dealing with these types of incidents, from different variants to different types of activities that the Bureau is engaged in, both with actual, single victims and sort of on a macro level?
Yeah. So if I can, I'd like to hit on a couple of things that were discussed there. I think going back to the hospital situation, I think with the hospitals, with JBS, with Colonial, those were turning points, I think, in this country of when I initially spoke about the nature of the ransomware threat. It was seen as a nuisance, and I would say it was probably that was probably till about 2 years ago that people considered a nuisance. It was an increasing nuisance, but it wasn't until those events and until some of these attacks on the health sector that people recognized this actually has a real life, real world impact on me and all of us. And it's unfortunate it got to that point on it, but we are seeing it more and more. And so I think the lesson from that is that the more engagement that we have with the private sector early on, the better it is. And that starts pre-incident. And so, when I talk about ransomware and kind of the nature of it, I've got 5 kids. My youngest is 14. So I've gone through the teenage years a number of times. And I think of ransomware as having teenagers, is that the time that they come and ask you for something is the time when you're distracted, when you got other things going on, and it's, I need to go here, and everyone's going there, and they make you make decisions when you don't want to make decisions.
Yeah.
And that is what happens in every single ransomware incident. And so if you're not planning for it, you're going to deal with it like you do your teenager and maybe acquiesce and do some things that you would later on you wish you hadn't done. So having that plan in place of how you're going to respond to these things, and included in that plan is who are you going to contact from law enforcement? I know, and we'll probably talk through this of, what are the factors of when and how you engage with law enforcement. But at the end of the day, you need to know who it is. And that's going to be, for us, it's your local FBI contact, your local FBI cyber supervisor. If you don't know who they are, you need to find out who they are. And we can help with that. We can put people in touch. We do a lot of outreach in our 56 field offices so people know who we are, so that when there is that incident, it's not the first time that you've engaged with us. There's 2 things you get from that. One, there's a level of comfort. I've got someone I call, and it's got to be the name and the phone number. It's also understanding what it's going to look like when we come out there, and what sort of value that we bring to this. So to that intelligence function, one of the things that we've done is that we're in 56 field offices. We have ransomware events happening every day across the country. And 10 years ago, or 9 years ago when this started, you'd be opening up a case on every single victim that came out there. And what we've done is we've consolidated and said one office is going to handle a particular area. So, for example, Nikibi, Reval, that was handled out of our Dallas office. And so anytime there was a incident involving those actors, it was sent to the Dallas office. Now, is that inside baseball? A little bit, but there's actually value that you get from that. Because if you're in Seattle and you get impacted by that, you're going to reach out to your local Seattle contact, and they're going to then either engage with the Dallas office or put Dallas on the phone with you, and they're going to walk you through, here's what their TTPs are, here's their IOCs, here's what you can expect in the negotiation process. Some of these things you maybe get from private industry, and that's great if you're getting it from an incident response firm or a law firm, but we're also going to provide that to you. And then our ask is that at the end of it is that we want the IOCs of how they got and the vector of how they got into your company. We want any TTPs that you've been able to develop. We want to understand, we want to get the wallet that if you're going to make a payment, where it went to so we can trace it. And what our ask is that that happens in as close to real time as possible. The successes that we've seen over this last year and a half with our ability to go out and seize money is predicated on getting that information, particularly the wallet information, early on. It doesn't mean that we're going to be able to seize it right away, but getting that information early enables us to do the tracing and tracking that we need to do, and that when we can, we will use that data and we make our own luck. We make our own luck because we're working hard behind the scenes on it, and when we get an opportunity, we'll exploit it and try and get that money back to you. And we may not. What I can tell you is I can't promise that we can get the money back, but I can promise if you don't call us, you will not get the money back.
Good points, Bryan. Thank you very much. But let's shift gears here. We've got a bit of time left, but I want to shift and talk about other benefits of sort of working with law enforcement, and in particular, compliance. Steve, Phyllis, from your perspective, have things changed with regard to compliance, and in particular, with regard to whether regulators view your communicating with law enforcement or not communicating with law enforcement to be material?
One thing I would point out is that you see a lot now on the state regulatory side of things, the forms that you have to fill out when you've had a breach. They are asking now, are you working with law enforcement? Who are you working with? What's their telephone number? What's their email address? So clearly that's something they're expecting, that you're reaching out to the FBI or other law enforcement, you're working with them closely. And obviously there's delays built into a lot of those laws if the FBI or other law enforcement, need you to not publicize it. A lot of those laws provide for that. So I think there's definitely on the state side of things, on the breach side of things, an expectation that you are reaching out to law enforcement and working with them very closely.
And I think that second part is important because it's the question is no longer have you notified law enforcement. It's are you working with law enforcement, right? And what's that look like? Phyllis, how about from your perspective on sort of the compliance landscape and how it's changed with regard to law enforcement interactions?
So I would agree that regulators expect companies to act like good corporate citizens and report criminal activity. And in that context, of course, an organization is developing its own chronology. So, if it's dealing with an attack by criminals and not reporting to law enforcement, then they can't say that they immediately reached out and reported. They can't say that they are cooperating with with law enforcement. So I think those are definite issues to consider. We also know that there's more focus on the potential of sanctions associated with making payments, and a mitigating factor there is working with law enforcement. Now, there's a big question mark in terms of exactly what that means because it's not outlined, but it's important to, particularly if you're considering making a ransom payment, I think part of appropriate diligence is absolutely reaching out to law enforcement and providing information so that you can get that threat intelligence to see if the entity or the wallet or the threat group is on the sanctions list or associated with threat actors who are. And we all saw how there was a real hands-off Conti when they came out publicly in support of Russia during the war. Boy, they shot themselves in the foot for a number of ways by infighting between themselves, the threat actors, the Russians and the Ukrainians, but then also taking a position that made many facilitators of payments hands off, where they weren't willing to pay because of that risk. And so there are a lot of I think, positive reasons for being quick to reach out to law enforcement. Let me shift, though, Ed, and talk about some of the cons that organizations think about, because I think we've been pretty much in Bryan's camp so far in the discussions, and we need to speak to what some organizations think about in this context. And one is concern about losing control of their own investigation, and whether this is true or not. And I think the way the FBI handles these matters, I have seen a shift, that it's more victim focused, obviously not acting in the role of a regulator, but really focused on attribution and prosecution and assisting a victim of crime. But there is risk that the FBI will start asking for information at a time where the client is very focused on responding, recovering, remediating, and does not feel like they have the time to focus on cooperating. So that's one issue. Another issue is, particularly with public companies, keeping information inside the organization, and the fear that information could become public prematurely before they're ready to make it public. And so there's always that concern that there may be some kind of a leak, or that in sharing data, and Bryan, you may want to speak to this in terms of how your databases work, but when you share IOCs, some of them are specific to the organization. And there is a concern that in sharing it, it will become known across numerous government agencies, as well as potentially outside of government, that they're a victim of a cyber attack. So those are some of the concerns, I think, that organizations think about as they're getting their arms around exactly what's happening in the context of that cybersecurity event.
Yeah, and Bryan, to add to that, our clients generally are not accustomed to dealing with law enforcement as a victim. If they've interacted with the FBI or other agencies at all, maybe it was in the context of a subpoena that they received or an investigation that's ongoing. So the notion of having the FBI come in to help isn't necessarily a familiar one for everyone. What do you think about that? What would you say?
Yeah, no, I certainly understand that. What I can say is that we treat victims as victims. And, I used to work organized crime at one point. And so there's a dichotomy of going out there where a bunch of them got involved in a Ponzi scheme as a victim. And so there we are helping them as victims of a crime when we know in the past what they've done on the other side of it. That's the state that, we're comfortable working at. We have to balance those lines there. And so in these types of situations, what I will tell you is that when you call us, we are not coming in with the blue coats, and we're not coming in and taking your servers and taking all of your data. This is a back and forth between us and you. What works for you on your end? There's going to be some certain things that we're going to ask for right away that's going to be extremely helpful. Some of those things I've gone through. It's the IOCs, the TTPs, and the wallet information. That's the basic stuff at the beginning. Everything else, we can do that in due course, in due time. But those are the types of things that actually really will help a victim. So that's what we're going to ask for first. If there is,
hey, Bryan, on that point, one thing that I have seen change, and this goes to, preservation of privilege. It used to be that agents would always ask for forensic reports, and detailed information. I have seen a greater recognition that they shouldn't necessarily ask for things that may be considered privilege. And we all know that there's a lot to having an appropriate privilege protocol to maintain that privilege so that there isn't concern about sharing that with third parties. But I do think that's another area of concern for organizations. And part of it is ensuring that the folks who are coordinating and providing information to law enforcement are really providing those artifacts, things that aren't privileged, that would be appropriate to share, that would be discoverable anyway, and that can assist. The other thing that I've seen change, I used to see FBI coming in with a written list of questions and want the organization to respond in writing. And there's great hesitancy early on in an internal investigation, particularly if it's privileged, to provide that in writing. I've seen more agents much more willing to accept sort of an oral report about the facts as opposed to handing over that list of written questions.
Yeah, and I think on that point, it's important to keep in mind that although we're interacting on behalf of our clients with the FBI in their role as victim, they don't get to just leave all the other roles, the competing roles that they have to play behind. So we're probably also dealing with regulators at the same time. Depending on the incident and particularly how public it is, we may already be dealing with class action litigation or other types of disputes. And it's not uncommon for us to get the question of, what have you shared with the FBI or with anyone else about this incident? Because we want that. We do not believe it's privileged. If it was privileged, you've waived it, and we now want you to produce it. So, Steve, thoughts on this tightrope walking exercise of cooperating with law enforcement but not shooting yourself in the civil foot, so to speak?
Well, one thing I sort of wanted to get your all's thoughts on is sort of the communications, public relations side of this, and how I think it can be a benefit to be working with law enforcement. I mean, obviously, if you've had an attack, it becomes public, especially if there's personal information, PII involved, and you're having to be reporting this to regulators and to individuals. You know, the organization is going to face the obvious questions about what have you done to protect my data? How did it get out? And what are you doing in the response and the remediation standpoint? And I think, to me, being able to say publicly that the victimized organization has notified the FBI or other law enforcement and working with law enforcement strengthens the company's sort of message to the public that they're doing all they can to sort of remediate and address the situation. I think that looks better than some organization that's sort of, you know, pulled up the drawbridge, so to speak.
And
I want to ask another question of the group, and
if I can add to
from
that,
the perspective. Oh, go ahead. You need to respond. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, because I think, you know, it goes back to the comment made about losing control of the investigation. Is that we've got a lot of experience because we see this across 56 field offices every single day, and we will work with you as to what we think and what's been helpful in the past and has worked well in the past. It's your decision or your client's decision what they want to do. But we're happy to provide that guidance and that expertise that we've developed over the years, as well as then if you play this thing out into the point when we actually go public. So we will not make any comments. We're not going to share any information with the public unless that's something that you want us to say. So if you want us to say no comment, or if you want us to say, yes, we're working with the FBI and we're happy to say, yes, we're working with company X on this, we're aware of the situation. But when we get to the point where we actually have charges, maybe we've arrested somebody, we've got a sentencing, we've got a seizure, those types of things, we are also communicating back to the victims on those events to let them know what's happening so that they can prepare their own press release on it. So they understand that this is, you know, it may have been a year ago, but it's going to come back up here. And typically those are really good stories. It's a good story because we've got somebody in custody, we've taken some sort of significant action, and that's going to be predicated on the cooperation we got from the victim. And so we will work with you throughout that process so that you understand what's happening there. And I think you've seen a change over the last couple of years, and you saw it with Kaseya, and you saw it with LA School District recently, is we are working side by side, hand in hand with them. It's not an easy thing to do, but it's really important for us, and I think there's a real benefit to the victim.
You were reading my mind, Bryan, because that's where I was going next is, hey, we caught your hacker. Now we need your help. We're going to grand jury in 2 weeks. You're going to be testifying. Where's your CISO? He's going to be testifying, or someone's going to be testifying. This is then going to end up in charges. Maybe the bad guy pleads out. Maybe he doesn't. What's that look like, Phyllis, Steve, Bryan, from your sort of collective perspectives for an organization that's now caught up in the criminal justice process, which is playing out in a courtroom publicly? Subpoenas are coming from the defendant to the victim organization. I want all information about your cybersecurity program and your incident response. I have a constitutional right to it. So how are we dealing with those issues? What are some of the big pitfalls and practices that you advise clients to follow?
Well, I can kick us off. And first I'll say, I wish, maybe this is wearing my former prosecutor hat, that we saw more actions go further when it comes to prosecution of cyber crimes. I think we're still looking at many individuals who may be indicted, but there's not a lot of additional steps that can be done because of where they sit. I would love to see more prosecutions go further, but appreciate the effect of indictments. Once we go down that path, I think there's a different role of the victim and obviously an expectation of cooperation with law enforcement. And I think the company probably has some responsibilities to support that as a victim of the crime. But it does impact the company from a public perspective, because they might have moved on. That event might have occurred 2 years ago and they were able to recover and move on, and now it's back in the press. That's not always good for an organization, even though it's a good story about proceeding forward with the prosecution. Oftentimes an organization is ready to just have it behind them and move forward. And so that's important to have a legal team in there to be able to support and to help witnesses become prepared, and to have a comms team in there to work through some of those issues that may once again impact the brand, because we're reminding everyone of the event that occurred. Steve?
I would just add that I thought that was really good, Phyllis. I would just add that, to Ed's point earlier, the criminal justice system and the rights you have, the Brady rights that a defendant is going to have to serve subpoenas and get information, really it could potentially put a company, they're going to want to see the perpetrator punished. But like Phyllis said, a couple of years have passed, this sort of faded out of the public memory. And now you're potentially, if there's a class action going and some civil actions going, you're going to have to potentially be providing stuff to the prosecutors and then which will have to be turned over to the defense that you may not want out there. And that's one factor I see that definitely could be problematic and sort of re-victimize, so to speak, a company that's already been victimized and thought it put this incident behind it.
Yeah, in many ways. Go ahead, Bryan.
I think we recognize that in the conversations that we have prosecutors on this stuff, even as they go through the charging documents, of being thoughtful of how it gets charged and the language that's used in there, because certain things, there may be proprietary technology that would really hurt the victim again. And so maybe that doesn't get included in the charges, but for us to understand kind of those things, because it doesn't really impact whether we're going to make the case or not. And so we can choose how we charge that thing. And I know there's some difficult decisions that have to be made on this, but the best way for us to have an impact on this threat is to actually get these people in custody. As we talked at the beginning, that this is organized crime that's doing this, and that means it's individuals. And the arrest and incarcerating these individuals, that's our end goal on it. It may not be achievable in every instance, and there's a whole host of things that we're doing now, that playbook that we have that's much more expansive. And whether it's financial sanctions, whether it's civil actions against entities, whether it's foreign partners taking actions against them, we are using everything in our toolkit as well as the toolkits of every partner. But the best thing to do is get them here in American prison where they're going to serve 10 to 15 years, unlike in other places. And that stops behavior. And we have seen with some of the success that we've had over this last year of some pretty high profile arrests that the adversary is talking about. And they're talking about the Netwalker sentencing of 20 years of an individual in Florida. And that's impacting people. So the more we can have of that, which is all predicated on the victim coming forward to us.
Yeah,
Well, and
disruption
Bryan-
and deterrence are so important. Go ahead, Phyllis.
Yep. Thanks, Ed. What I was going to say, I think that law enforcement, FBI, DOJ is very conscious too early on, particularly in the indictment stage, of not even naming the organization. So, and oftentimes, your indictments actually are of groups that had victimized many organizations. And so it's not just one company that's being held out as a victim. So I think that's gotten better, the whole attitude about being conscious about protecting the victims and not, as Steve said, re-victimizing because we're bringing up again. So in those cases where you may not have the ability to really pursue a trial, and so you don't get to that point, then, that company is not a focus of the press release that's then issued by Main Justice or by the FBI.
I think that's a great point. It is seldom the case, if ever at this point, where you are a solitary victim of the threat actors who are being brought before courts. Another thing that I think is important as we talk about playing these contemporaneous and competing roles. We're now seeing instances where the judges we're in front of in data breach class actions have sentenced some of the defendants in these attacks. They've seen these cases. So when you're in there as a defendant saying, hey, we're really a victim, you now may be talking to a judge who understands that in a very sort of specific way. That was not the case just a few years ago. There's a lot that's been going on in terms of educating the bench about these crimes, that they're not victimless crimes, that they are very impactful. So I think, we're seeing an evolution in the courtroom with regard to both civil and criminal liability and what it means to be an organizational victim of these crimes.
So, Ed, if I can add a footnote to that, as we all know, too, the legal standards really revolve around reasonableness. And so when we think about an organization's cybersecurity program and the reasonableness of that program, they also need to think about what messages they're sending by not cooperating with law enforcement. Because ultimately, from a litigation perspective, they probably will want to take the position that it was a pretty sophisticated threat actor who came in there and exploited some vulnerability, and that in and of itself did not indicate that their program was unreasonable. So I do think as those decisions are being made, they will play out and become an important part of the company's defense in front of different stakeholder groups.
Yeah, great point. What does that opening statement look like, right? If you end up in front of a jury. So we have just 2 minutes left. I want to go to each of you for sort of a closing thought on this. And Bryan, you're the guest of honor, so we'll start with you.
All right. Well, thank you. The engagement with victims is really important to us. And I think there's been a shift within the Bureau of where we need to make sure that we're adding value. And so the way that we're conducting this incident response now, where we're coming to the victim and we already know TTPs, we already know IOCs, we've got intel products, and that agent who's responding has them at their fingertips. And so they can provide that information right there and then to the victim. So you're going to get value right away from that engagement, as well as then we've got the questions and the information that we need from you that's going to help that case agent make progress further on. And we've seen real examples of that recently where we provided IOCs, they identified additional activity within their network, but then also new information, which then a week later we were able to share with somebody else to make them safer. That only happens because we've got the engagement going back and forth. So we certainly, patriotically, we want you to engage with us, but it also serves your own interests.
Thank you very much. Phyllis.
I would just add plan and preparation. Engagement with law enforcement should be part of the incident response plan. Organizations should tabletop those questions and really think about it in the context of different scenarios. And then sometimes the FBI is even willing to participate in a tabletop and talk about some of these issues, which can be super helpful.
Steve.
Really quick, I'll just piggyback what on Bryan said. Quick response matters. Last July, DOJ announced they seized $500,000 in crypto because of 2 healthcare providers that had paid that in ransom. But the healthcare providers cooperated with the FBI right away, and they were able to get those ransoms back. And I think that's just because they engaged quickly.
And I'll just wrap it up by thanking everyone for joining us. Working with law enforcement is not going to solve all of your problems in one of these incidents, but you are a crime victim and you are expected to act like one. So with that in mind, Bruce, we'll turn it back over to you, and we hope that everyone enjoys the rest of the day.
Thank you, Phyllis, Steve, Bryan. Thank you so much. And Ed, thanks for moderating. Really well done.